not once, but twice, former Middletown Press employee.
Glove for punishment.
That's right. Former, let's see, when we, the press, had a bureau down in Old Saybrook, covered Old Saybrook and Westbrook, first job out of college, was the police reporter, was the education reporter, was the sports guy, then was also the county editor, was also the sports editor before I left for good in 1994. Worked in both buildings. If you want building trivia, we played building trivia before. 472 Main Street up there, and the new building, which is now the Gone building, where Mondo's is. That's that building where Mondo's is. That's where we used to be. So we do these sessions all over the state, and we keep this one informal. It's a smaller group, you know. I think the first thing I would ask is, does anybody have any specific? By the way, great job on the survey. We read it. It's, you know, give yourselves kudos on that. Those of you who worked on it or helped with it at all. It's the sort of thing that when we had more staff, we did a couple times. We did one for municipalities back in '99, and then we did one shortly after I joined FOI in 2001 with state agencies. And you know, you can go back and look at those. I think we still have them online, and those results weren't so hot either. Yours actually yielded more, I would say, positive results than I think ours did. Some of the departments obviously weren't real swift on what they were doing. Others, I thought, did a pretty good job. Freedom of information. The first thing that people need to understand is that it's the law in the state of Connecticut. A lot of people, you made the comment that, you know, isn't it ironic that the people being paid to uphold the law are breaking it? It's not just this great novel idea that we should be open and accessible. It's the law in the state of Connecticut. So, you know, when you go somewhere and they say, oh no, we don't want to let you in, that's not, well, if it's an open meeting, then it's a meeting that you have a right to be in. They're breaking the law if they tell you about it. It's not really something that they have an option on. It's, the law in Connecticut is based on a simple concept. Ooh, a simple concept. This is a quote from James Madison. This is sort of the foundation, and it's also part of the founding of our country. A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. People who mean to be their own governor must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. For democracy to work, people need to know what's going on. Need to be transparent, government needs to be open, needs to be accessible. And a lot of times people in the public sector don't get that. There is this sort of philosophy of secrecy, this veil of secrecy that they try to operate under, especially those who've come from the private sector. You all cover different boards and commissions, a lot of volunteers, and well, that's not how we do it at work. Well, no, of course not, because you've got different standards that you have to meet here when you're holding a board meeting. So the law in Connecticut came into being 39 years ago. It was Ella Grasso's brainchild when she ran for governor for the first time. And if you do the math, 39 years ago puts us right smack in the middle of Watergate. And she was in Congress when Watergate exploded all over the place. And she was, I'm told, moved to, you know, sort of extreme agita by what she saw. Government behind closed doors, secret government, government being conducted without any concept of what was important as far as transparency goes. So she came back to run for governor, and she said, if I'm elected, we're going to have an open government law of some kind. And it's going to be, it's so important that she made it one of the primary planks in her first campaign platform in 1974. And then she said, somewhat startlingly, it's so important that it'll be approved unanimously by our legislature. Has anybody ever covered the legislature? Ever watched the legislature? Can you imagine guaranteeing unanimity on something like that? She guaranteed it, and she got it. I've actually seen the vote. There wasn't a single no vote. But again, if you're familiar with the process, it obviously didn't get there by accident. There was a lot of backroom trading and a lot of I like this and you like that. And so to get there were certain things that when you look at this law now, it's sort of muddy. You know, there are gray areas. I suspect there are times when somebody tells you, no, you can't have that record, it's exempt. And you look at the law and you say, is it or isn't it? Because it's sometimes it's not always clear, it's not always crisp. It doesn't fit into that nice, neat box that James Madison gave us in the mid-1700s. Which means that you on the front line have to be able to interpret the law. Sometimes, you know, you walk up to a meeting and they say, oh, I'm sorry, it's executive session, you can't come in. You know, you gotta know to ask them, why are you in executive session? Why? And when they state the reason, when they give you the reason, you have to know whether or not they're yanking your chain, or whether or not they're accurate, whether or not there's a real reason for, you know, for going into executive session. So what I'll do, again, probably a little less formally than usual. I go around, I give what I call FOI 101. I'll give you some of the basics, but I think as reporters out in the field, you know a lot of the basics. What I'd really like to do is have you ask questions about some of the nuances you faced, and then maybe that'll generate some discussion. But the first thing is to remember that the law is about access to two basic things, to public meetings and to public records. A lot of people start off on the wrong foot. They say, well, under FOI, I'm going to start asking questions. And the law technically doesn't require a public agency to answer questions. It requires them to give you the document that might have the answer to that question, or attend the meeting that might answer that question. But technically, when you call up town hall or city hall, they don't have to answer questions. Under FOI, you may have a right to that information, but you've got to get it yourself. And a lot of people think that we are sort of the answer people for anything in the state of Connecticut. I get questions on the phone. That's where I spend most of my time when I'm at the office, answering questions on the phone. It's a rapid fire questions, and emails come in. And they're all over the lot. We got a call the other day from a woman who asked me to check, to look up for her how many gun permits she still has that are legitimate. You know, no, lady, we don't keep those. I mean, that's not what the FOI Commission in Hennick is designed to do. An email today from a firm in New Jersey asking me for records about health violations at a McDonald's in Monroe. You know, I mean, no, it's about making sure that people have access, but only when they believe they've been denied access. Our commission is established so that if you believe you've been denied access, you file a complaint against the agency in question, and then we adjudicate that complaint. Let me read for you the definition of a public meeting. Meeting means any hearing, or, by the way, you all, in one way or another, have to cover meetings? One way or another? Okay. Meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, and any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, to discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. Any time they gather to do their work, they're having a meeting. One of the first things you'll hear, especially during budget season, well, it's just a workshop. It's not an FOI. You don't have to come. It doesn't matter what they call it. With just a little task force, you don't have to worry about it. If they're doing the work of the board, it's a meeting. It needs to be noticed. It needs to be open to the public, and there need to be minutes when they're done. Well, we're going to form a little subcommittee. And the subcommittee's not the whole board, so we're not going to worry about it. Has anybody heard any of these, by the way? This is you're lucky if you haven't, because those are the typical excuses, the typical thoughts that they have. Some of them, by the way, actually believe this. They haven't delved into the law. They haven't dug in deep enough.
So it's a public meeting, even if there's like for example, one of the towns that I cover has 3 Democrats in the town council.
Right.
If all 3 of them are in a room together, they're discussing town business,
Okay.
that's a public meeting?
There's a but. If it's just the 3 Democrats, the answer to your question is no. Hold the thought, but no. The subcommittee concept, though. A lot of people say, well, it wasn't the full board, so it's not a meeting. But when you define public agency, as this law defines it, including any committee of or created by. So it's very clear, if they create a subcommittee, that becomes a separate entity covered by the FOI Act as well. The law talks to folks about 3 different kinds of meetings: the regular meeting, the special meeting, the emergency meeting. Regular meeting is a meeting that they all submit schedules by the end of January of every year, or at least in theory they do. And it says we meet on the 1st and 3rd Tuesday, the 2nd and 4th Wednesday. That's when their regular meeting date is. Special meeting is a meeting they have when they're not supposed to meet, when they're not scheduled to meet, but they need to. Again, for both of the regular and the special meeting, they have to submit an agenda at least 24 hours in advance. The difference between the regular and the special is that at a special meeting, they can't add anything to that agenda once the meeting's in progress. At a regular meeting, you can. So should something come up that's not on the agenda, they can vote to add it to the agenda. People get hung up also on the special meeting. They put things like other business, new business, old business. Have you seen that on some of the agendas? Remember that that's okay at a regular meeting, but at a special meeting it isn't, unless there's a specific item under it, because what's supposed to happen is the chairman says, okay, any other business, when you get to other business. Well, at a regular meeting, you can say, okay, yes, we need to talk about topic X, make a motion, add it to the agenda. But if you can't do that, which you can at a special meeting, you shouldn't have other business on there because you can't bring anything else up. I've seen people get hung up on that before as well. The emergency meeting is a meeting that we always discourage boards and commissions from holding. It's an unnoticed meeting, which is reason number one. The law really wants boards and commissions to meet in public in noticed fashion. The hang-up is that what constitutes an emergency in the eyes of this law is the bar is set a lot higher than people think. Every Tuesday after Martin Luther King's birthday, every Tuesday after President's Day, I will get a call, at least one, from somewhere in the state that goes something like this. Tom, we have a regular Tuesday meeting tonight, and I always notice my Tuesday meeting on Monday, but I forgot we were closed yesterday. So I'm going to make tonight an emergency meeting, right? And oops is not an emergency. But many people think that, if you take the law out of it, it's an emergency. They got to quick hurry up and notice the meeting because they couldn't. The advice there, by the way, is always to wait and do it down the road. I'll share a little story with you about what can happen with an emergency meeting, just to give you an example of how badly things can go. Over in Ridgefield, the other side of the state, a couple years ago, the assistant fire chief thought he was going to become the next chief. And then he learned through the grapevine that he wasn't going to become the next chief. And he got really, really angry. And he stormed into the first selectman's office one afternoon. He slammed the door, screaming and yelling, and oh, I'm told it was a beauty. Stuff getting knocked off chairs and doors and everything. First selectman says, look, you can curse at me all afternoon. You're not going to be the next chief. That's just not going to happen. So the guy says, but I tell you what, you've been an okay employee. We'll make you the interim chief while we look for a new chief. It'll look better on your resume. Guy's still not thrilled, but he says okay and he leaves. But Ridgefield, like Durham, like Middletown, like Killingworth, it's small towns. And it didn't take very long to word get out. The phone starts ringing off the hook, the emails start coming in, the text messages going, this is terrible, this is horrible, he's a threat, he's a danger, get him out of there. So the first selectman thinks about it and he says, okay. And he decides, this happened on a Friday afternoon, that he's going to have an emergency meeting the next morning. Emergency Board of Selectmen meeting the next morning to talk about the status of the fire chief. Soon to be, anyway, the interim fire chief. So they have the meeting, they say, you know what, the guy, that's no good, that's inappropriate behavior, he's fired, he's out. So they send somebody to go find him, which was kind of interesting. They didn't go look for him, they send somebody to go find him. It's a Saturday morning in the early spring, so he's painting his house or something like that. They bring him down, he looks like, you know what, he's terrible. They bring him in, thanks for coming down, you're fired. He gets mad all over again, he says, you can't fire me, I quit. So they reconvene the emergency meeting and accept his resignation. Now he thinks about it a little bit. Remember what I said, the FOI commission is in place to adjudicate situations where people believe they've been denied access. And he says, by not noticing that meeting, I've been denied access to their decision-making process. And he files a complaint with the FOI commission. He says, there was no emergency there. That meeting should have been noticed. They had no business having an unnoticed meeting. So he files a complaint. The complaint comes to the commission. The hearing officer says, you know what, no emergency. The commission says no emergency. And together, they declare null and void everything that happened at that meeting. That's one of the more powerful tools the FOI commission has. If they believe that a meeting is just totally an in-your-face, we don't care about open government sort of thing, they can do that. So they declare it null and void, which means he was fired and or quit at a meeting that didn't happen, if you think about it. So now, that could be the end of the story, but then it wouldn't be a good story. Ridgefield did what every loser, if you will, every unsuccessful party at the FOI commission can do. It appealed it. It took it all the way to the state Supreme Court. Now, remember I told you this is about interpretation. We get interpreted too. The FOI commission isn't always upheld. We have to make decisions too. But in this case, the state Supreme Court said, you know what, FOI commission, you were absolutely right. There was no emergency there, and we also declare null and void what happened in that meeting. That was in January of 2010 that took place. It's now more than 4 years later. I originally heard that they had finally figured out, how to smooth things over. But I did one of these a couple months ago, and there's a guy sitting about where you're sitting, and he starts laughing. He says, they didn't figure anything out. They're still fighting about it. Almost more than 4 years later, they're still fighting about What do you think? How much back pay do they owe? There's a rumor that he had somebody who should have been on his benefits who had some medical issues, and he had to cover them. And now he's fighting for the benefits that he should have had because he was. The kicker is that the person they ultimately hired is now retiring. And guess who's on the candidates list to take the job? Same guy. All they had to do was notice a meeting. All they had to do was, and that portion of it would not have, I mean, he may have gone after them on other fronts, but by not noticing the meetings, they left themselves vulnerable, and they're still fighting. They might actually hire him to put him on the payroll. Maybe that'll be part of the agreement, and drop all your claims to anything else. I don't know. People ask, what is a real emergency? What constitutes an emergency? When Hurricane Sandy was bearing down on us, there were a lot of emergency meetings, where to evacuate, where to have shelters, things like that. It's life and death type stuff. Or, maybe a little less dramatic, this winter, there were several calls about emergency meetings. Anybody want to guess why?
Road salt?
Road salt, bingo. People were running out of road salt, and they had to act really quickly to go out and buy some, and they didn't have money in the budget. They had to meet almost, within minutes to appropriate the funds to go get the salt. I mean, public safety is in question there, and so, those are legitimate. I always tell boards and commissions that if you're going to have some kind of emergency, you can always get the word out. I mean, if Middletown needs an emergency, and we need to meet without notice, I tell them to call you. And those of you from New Haven, the different surrounding towns, call somebody, let them know. That way, at least they know you're not hiding anything. You're meeting without notice, but at least you're not hiding anything. These meetings are open to the public. Don't ever feel as if you have to sign a sheet to say I'm coming in. You don't have to identify yourself as a reporter or anything like that. You just go in and sit down and attend these meetings. You have every right to be there. Anybody does. You can also audio or videotape these meetings. Has anybody ever had a problem with that, walking in with a camera or a tape recorder or anything like that? There are some towns that are camera shy, but once the meeting is open, the camera's on. They can set rules, sort of parameters. Let's say this is the meeting room and we say that's the camera location. They can hold to that and not let you, run in front of the board while they're talking, but they can't stop you. Remember that the meeting law does not guarantee anybody the right to speak at a public meeting. A lot of people think that it does. Only the right to attend. So if you're at a meeting sometime and people are, clamoring to speak and the board doesn't want to hear from them, I mean, they may have a whole different mess on their hands with their bylaws or with politics or something like that, but there's no requirement that anybody be allowed to speak at a public meeting. The gentleman over here asked the question about the 3 Democrats. There's 2 paths that boards and commissions can take to exclude the public. One's executive session, we'll talk about that in a second, but the other one's one of those that sort of gives you a chuckle. I read you the definition of a meeting. The sentence in the law that follows that goes like this: meeting does not include. Meeting does not include. There follows a list of, for lack of a better word, gatherings, many of which we would call meetings. But for the purposes of freedom of information, they're not meetings, which means they're not noticed, they're not open, and there are no minutes. And the scenario that was described was 3 Democrats on the same board, and I believe this is one of those negotiated pieces that got that unanimous vote. If you think about that, you've got a 5-member board, and 3 of them are the same party, they're in control. So if they go off, down the hall or to the pizza place or Amici's or something like that, and they have a discussion, and they set the parameters of what they're going to do, and they walk in, and every vote is 3-2, all in favor, well, they've clearly met and talked about it. But the law says that that is a caucus. And the law says that they are allowed to do that, even though they are probably talking about board business. Here's the rub on that. It's only same board, same party. So if those 3 Democrats are joined by the chairman of the Board of Finance or the town chairman of the party, then they've got an issue. Same board, same party. We had an issue here in Middletown a couple years ago with the Board of Education, and the Dems were caucusing over on Honey Hill Avenue. And I think it was the superintendent, just sort of walked in and said hello at the exact same time that the R's were walking into the building, and they went, bananas, and they filed a complaint and all that stuff. They ultimately proved that all he did was walk in to pick up his mail and say hello, but just that appearance of the superintendent being in that room triggered the possibility that that was no longer a caucus. So I always advise people, if you're going to caucus, make sure it's only same board, same party. It's a giant loophole in the concept of open government, but it's allowed.
Going back to what you mentioned about speaking, not free FOI, not guaranteeing that the public can speak at a public meeting. If the board or commission allows the public to speak on a regular basis at a public meeting, can the board chairman, whoever's running the meeting, limit the length of discussion?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's nothing in the FOI Act prohibits, just a little secret, in case you know, I live right down the road in Durham, and I was on the Region 13 Board of Ed for 10 years. And at budget time, what we did was we had a very strict limit, because if you've covered budget meetings, you know that everybody wants to be heard and has a lot to say. So we said, look, there's a 3-minute limit, we're not being rude, that's it, say what you have to say in 3 minutes. We had the little egg timer, bang, bang, bang. And so yes, absolutely, that's very well within their rights to do that. Some of the other things that are in that category, by the way, that category of things that are not a meeting, has anybody heard the term non-meeting while you're out there covering? That's what people have taken to calling some of these non-meetings, which is pretty funny when you think about it. Collective bargaining is in there. If you cover any towns that have union representation and they're negotiating a contract of some kind, collective bargaining is not covered by that. So there's not notice, that's not open, and there's no minutes. Another one that's in there is if they form an executive level search committee. Let's suppose that a board of education needs a new superintendent. They form an executive level search committee to look for a new super. That group, in that capacity only, I mean, they can't talk about other business, can meet without notice, without being open, and without minutes.
What about, you mentioned collective bargaining is protected.
Yeah.
But recently West Hartford, they came to an agreement. They avoided, they were going to go to mediation.
Right.
And what would have been, if they had to hire legal counsel, that would have been, that's beyond mediation. They avoided that.
If they went to arbitration, you mean?
Right, they avoided the arbitration.
Okay.
So would any of that,
When you go to binding arbitration, that hearing is open because you've concluded your negotiations.
Right.
When you go to binding arbitration in Connecticut, you're putting your last best offers on display. And so that, we have ruled that session, that binding arbitration hearing is public because there's no negotiation going on anymore.
And then just the town clerk's office would have a record of that? Is that where you go?
Probably not. That's a state board that does
Okay.
that. So you probably want to check with the state board of ed if they went to arbitration. Yeah.
Or firemen, so that would be.
Oh, well, yeah, wherever,
Yeah.
right. Now, that's a sort of non-meeting category. The other way the public's excluded from a meeting is executive session. You've all heard that, right? I bet you've all been booted from a meeting or two because of an executive session, right? Remember, folks, that an executive session is a portion of a meeting that's publicly noticed. It is not a separate private meeting. Some boards, if they only have one item to talk about, and it is an executive session item, will not bother to notice it because the public's not coming in their mind. They still need to notice the meeting. It still needs to open in public, and there needs to be a vote to go into executive session for one of the 5 specific reasons for the executive session. They need to vote, the motion needs to reflect that. They go into executive session, they can talk till the cows come home, but they must come out of the executive session to take whatever action they're going to take. Be very wary of a board that comes out of executive session and says, well, we just decided to, because that means they took action behind the closed doors, and that's just not allowed. 5 reasons for an executive session, broadly stated. A personnel matter, pending claims and pending litigation, a security matter, a property transaction, the town is looking to build a new school and is looking at land and they're negotiating for new property. 5th one is something of a catch-all. It allows a board or commission to go into executive session to talk about the contents of a document or documents that they believe are exempt from disclosure. A simple example would be the board seeks legal opinions from its attorney on a particular issue. It goes into executive session to talk about the advice that its attorney has written for them. They're going to claim the attorney-client privilege. They're not going to share it with anybody else, so they're going to have that discussion behind closed doors. Anybody deal with boards that put out bid packages, bids and RFPs? Bids and RFPs are exempt from disclosure on a temporal basis. when they are submitted, they can be withheld until either a contract is signed or the negotiations have failed. So let's suppose the police commission is gonna look at bids for new cruisers. Takes them, puts them all on the table, goes into executive session, and sort of dissects them and looks them over. It can do that, it can bring in the bidders to, you know, to give them advice, information on what's in there.
At what point do they become public?
They become public when negotiations cease or when the contract is signed, whichever comes first.
What about the other personnel pending claims litigation? When, if and when that becomes public, when does that happen?
Okay, personnel executive session. First of all, don't ever be at a meeting or look at an agenda that says executive session personnel, because the courts have ruled over and over again that that's not enough. Need to tell you more than just personnel. Now, they don't have to put a name out there, but executive session, discussion of a police officer, discussion of a Board of Ed employee, something like that. There's got to be a little more than that in there, so be aware of that.
So with the little more is what? I mean, what are the
Just-
parameters of a little more? Anything?
Anything more? Yes.
Your name was taken in vain in Cromwell about this 2 weeks ago.
Oh, yeah?
Executive session, town employee.
Okay.
Said you gotta do better than that, and they said, no, we talked to Tom, and he said we did.
Well, you know, you gotta have a little more than that. An employee of the town of Cromwell probably would be enough. Probably
Seriously?
would be enough, yeah.
We were unpleasant and pushed the issue, and they finally said a town hall employee.
Okay. You know, that was my initial recommendation to them, I think. The guys knew, he called several times. Yeah.
Yes, he isn't adverse to openness in any form.
Yeah, okay.
Isn't there some kind of provision, and I've worked in other states, so maybe I'm confusing it with something in another state, but if the public employee is at the meeting and consents to having the meeting, having his, what have you, open to the public.
Actually, there's a difference, there's a variation on that. The law says that if you are going to be discussed in an executive session, you have to be given notice in advance. And you have the right to come forward and say, you are not going to talk about me behind closed doors. I want it done publicly. That's the right that you have. You have the right to demand that it be done publicly. But if they wanted to discuss it publicly, there is no obligation for them to go into executive session. Technically, in theory, everything could be done publicly. But if they choose to go into executive session and you say no, they can't. And back to the question of, you know, how much is a little bit more, it's very subjective. The courts have said more than personnel, but not the name. So that's why, you know, that's why the wiggle room is in there. I say, they wanted to put down, I think, I'm trying to remember the sequence with Cromwell, because there were multiple calls. They said, executive session personnel. I said, well, no, that's not enough. You've got to give them more. Executive session, discussion of the performance of a town hall employee or a town employee, something like that. And evidently they resisted again until they went wider. But, you know, there's no way to know ultimately what, you know, where the fine line is, because we only know what it's not. You know, we know it's not personnel, and we know it's not. They have to give you some idea who they're talking about, if they can.
But
That's the bottom line.
They can put the name in.
Oh, of course they
Nobody's
can.
stopping them.
Yes, nobody's
from-
stopping them, but, you know, again, that culture of secrecy that we talked about, there's this aversion to putting that stuff out there. You know, this is one of those, executive session likely performance of the discussion of the police chief. Well, everybody knows, there's only one chief, you know, so, but sometimes you'll just see police chief, and then, you know, you can put the name on. Nothing's, there are times when not putting the name out there is reasonable. A charge or a claim has been made against an employee, and there's no real evidence that it's true. And if you put it out there, the person's reputation could be unnecessarily damaged. So then, you know, there might be room for just a little gray area. The executive session for personnel, the key is also to remember that they have the right to say no, but there is no right to demand to be in the executive session. You think about it intuitively. If you're going to talk about me in executive session, I get to be in that room. But that's not what the law says. The only way you get to demand to be in the room is if you have it all done publicly. The pending claims and pending lawsuit exemption is pretty much what it sounds like, and it allows discussion of strategy as it pertains to us, but you have to have been sued. It can't be a planning and zoning that says, you know, if we approve this, we're gonna get sued. So that's no good. So there's the only thing that makes it a little wider is that it allows a board or commission to go into executive session to talk about taking legal action. The board can go in and say, we're gonna sue somebody, and we need to talk about how to do that. Yeah.
Once again, Cromwell. Executive session pending litigation, they had an employee who resigned and for receiving money he was not entitled to. And they went into executive session to discuss that, but said, well, we may wind up taking legal action against him. I said, yeah, and pigs may fly, but they were like, no, really? I'm like, no, really? That's not pending litigation.
Yeah, but if that's, you know, again,
You're gonna get more calls about Cromwell.
many years ago, we proposed something that we thought made a lot of sense. Is every executive session should be recorded. And that the recording would not be a public record until or unless pigs were flying and somebody said, challenged it, said there's no way they were talking about that. And then the way it was structured would be the tape would come to the FOIC and we would listen to it. And if they indeed did what they said they were going to do, the tape remained sealed and unavailable to the public. But if they didn't, if they strayed, then it would come out and it would become a public record. Needless to say, that didn't fly. Remember, people want, I mean, we're all fighting an uphill battle. In my former life as a journalist and in your life, you know, what we do now and what you guys do, people don't really want to be open and transparent. But if they, you know, that's one of those, if they were talking about taking action against this guy to try to recover the money that he stole, then that's legit, if they were.
They might.
Yeah, but if they were saying, look, we're gonna do this, here's what, or you know, you could certainly challenge it, but if they have proof that they did, that's a tough one. One of the problems with executive session is that people on the outside don't know if they did what they said they were gonna do. I mean, legitimately, that's a legitimate, well, how do we know? I answered a question like that today. How do we know that that's actually what they were talking about? You have to trust them. I mean, really, you know, some people, there is no trust, so. The executive session for security matters, that really never came up too much until Newtown. And then we got a lot of boards needing to go into executive session to talk about where the security personnel were going to be placed, where the extra guards were going to be placed, where they were going to put the cameras, where they were going to put, you know, and that's all legit. That's very legitimate, and that's all in there. Again, remember that your boards cannot take action in an executive session. Make them vote in public, make it be very clear who votes for what or for whom. Any other thoughts or questions about executive session? You've all had to deal with it, right? By the way, if you, the camera's on, but if you happen to hear something in an executive session because you're close to the door, you're not violating anything. One of the ironies is the law allows boards to go into executive session, and obviously it's bad form for a board member to come out and blab about what happened, but there's no violation of the law if they do that. It's clearly, if you're on a board, and I've been on that side too, it's not right. You know, you have to have some sort of responsibility to the board you're on, but you know, if you hear something, you hear it. It doesn't mean you've broken any law. I've gotten calls from people who say, they wrote about what we said in executive session. I said, well, you know, oh well. So, when I read the definition of meeting, it had the phrase in it, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment. Electronic equipment was written 39 years ago for that powerful chair who would get on the phone and say, you're voting this way, you're doing this, you need to bring this up, boom, boom, boom. Walk into a full house, all in favor, all opposed. Everybody's wondering what happened. Well, what happened is they had the meeting on the phone before the meeting actually took place and everything was all lined up. You can't do that. And in 2014, we're talking about a lot more than telephones, texting, emails, Twitter, all those different things. Doesn't mean that you can't use it to disseminate information, but they can't have their meetings via these vehicles either. And there is this horrible temptation today. Well, how would I just sent one little email, and then, but if they start deliberating via email, it's the same as having a meeting.
Is that ex parte?
Well, it could be ex parte, but it's basically an unnoticed meeting as far as FOI goes. So, you know, if you're in a situation where you're sitting in a meeting and say, well, you know, we had that email discussion, and then the antennae should go up, and you should make a request for those emails because they're clearly public records, and you might be able to see where they actually made a decision via this email discussion that they had. Doesn't mean that they can't send information out. What do you guys, this is what I think about this topic, let's talk about it at the next meeting. That's fine, that's not a problem. It's if they start talking about it while they're not in the meeting, that could be an issue. You just want to, they need to be aware of that.
How would you know though? You know, if somebody sends it out, like the only way you would know is to ask to see their emails, right?
And you don't want to go on fishing expedition. Let me put my former editor hat on for a second. You don't want to keep doing that because you have to, I'd suggest that you be sure. You know, you don't want to keep asking for emails because then, and if you don't come up with anything, it doesn't come up right. But you will, I guarantee you that if you cover a board long enough, you'll know if they've talked about something beforehand. Your senses, your antennae will pick up the fact that there was some pre-decision involved here. And then you should ask to see the emails because you can bet dollars to donuts that that's how they did it.
I was going to ask sort of a George Carlin-esque question.
Yep.
In terms of if a board is holding a noticed public meeting, it's properly noticed and everything, and you get to the meeting and there's 2/3 of the board there, but one is participating via like a conference call, is that violating?
No, because it says it's a meeting whether in person or by means of electronic equipment. So if they decide to do it and have that person participate that way, that's perfectly legit. Yeah.
Because I know there's one board in Wallingford that does it on a regular basis because somebody goes on the trips to Florida.
Now, some towns don't like that, and they've put in provisions that say, look, in this town, you've got to be here or it doesn't count. Doesn't mean that they violated anything, it means that they've made a provision that's stronger than what the state law says. The other thing about meetings that we should talk about is minutes. Remember that minutes don't need to be the recreation of War and Peace. They don't need to be every single word that everybody says. A lot of people think that they do. As reporters, don't sort of think that, oh, well, I'll get it off of the minutes, because if their minutes are done correctly, they're succinct,